Thank you very much, Gwen, and let me also start by thanking you for giving me the opportunity to present to you the results of the China CCDR. I'm trying to share slides. I hope you can see them. Okay, so in case of China, like in Vietnam, we basically undertook this analysis and prepared this report over the last year and a half or so. The report focuses on both adaptation and increasing resilience, but it also puts a lot of emphasis on mitigation. Now, in the interest of time for the presentation today, I have focused mostly on the decarbonization agenda in this presentation. And let me start with a sort of a bit of a spoiler. The three key messages that emerge from the report and that I will then elaborate during the presentation. So the first message is that like in most other countries, in China's case, development and climate change are increasingly and deeply intertwined. And in China's case, that's because both China is a significant contributor to rising greenhouse gas emissions that are causing climate change, but it's also, of course, like many other countries, exposed to its consequences and vulnerable to the impacts and climate risks that are likely to intensify going forward. The second message is that China has set ambitious climate goals for itself, namely to achieve peak carbon emissions before 2030 and to get to carbon neutrality or net zero before 2060. And achieving these goals will be unprecedented in many regards. But, and that's the good news, our analysis suggests that it's economically and technically feasible to attain these goals, and I should add, attain them in a way that is development friendly and compatible with further increases in prosperity and sustained economic growth. And then the third and final message is that this transition is significant and therefore creates risks, both economic and social risks, but also opportunities. And very importantly, what we do find is that the extent to which these risks can be minimized and the opportunities can be grasped depends, at least to some extent, on the types of policies that are being adopted to achieve the goals. So now let me go into a more detailed discussion of these three findings. Before going actually and talking about China, what I thought I'd do with this first slide is to present or contextualize China's own climate objectives and the associated challenges and opportunities in the global context, because for China, this is obviously very important. And what I'm presenting here in this table is the carbon budget that the world as a whole, has left, basically, based on estimations that were done by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And these carbon budgets are essentially a simplified way to show how much more carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas can be emitted into the atmosphere to attain the temperature increase goals set in the Paris Agreement. So 1.5 degree increase, 1.7 degree or 2%, 2 degree centigrade increase in global temperatures. Now, what I've done is to simplify this and just take away a key message here, is I've translated these remaining carbon budgets in remaining years at current emissions levels. I basically just divided these numbers that are presented in the table by current emissions levels. And if I can just focus your attention on the mid set of results here, which shows basically 50% probability of achieving the given temperature goals. So the world as a whole taking a 50% bet of staying within, you know, these temperature goals. You can see that for the 1.5 degree increase, with a 50% probability, only about 7 years are left for the world as a whole in terms of current emissions. Now, we know that emissions are, of course, rising. So this is, in a way, a very conservative estimate. For the 2-degree increase, it looks a little bit less frightening, but it's still only 37 years left for the world as a whole to address the causes of climate change. Now, what this shows is, I think it's a very good illustration of not just the importance of acting on climate change among large emitters, I should add, but it shows that this is increasingly urgent and that it's no longer a question of acting now versus acting later. Now, if we move from that global challenge to China's challenge, as I mentioned, China has set, like many other countries, climate goals for itself to achieve peak carbon emissions and carbon neutrality by 2030 and 2060, respectively. And what we are showing here is a stylized representation of the necessary emissions reduction paths to achieve that goal relative to other major economies in the world. And what becomes very evident from that, including industrial countries, the US and the EU, what becomes apparent from that is that achieving China's goals is unprecedented in the sense that it requires a much faster reduction in emissions than has happened anywhere else in the world. The second dimension of the challenge, which is important, especially important in the context of thinking together climate and development in an integrated manner, is that China will not only have to achieve that transition faster than almost any other country, it will have to do so at much lower levels of per capita income and per capita emissions. And that's precisely what we are showing in the second graph here, which basically just plots per capita emissions on the y-axis and per capita income on the x-axis. And you can see these tend to go hand in hand, and then at a certain level of income, emissions per capita emissions tend to level and then ultimately decline. Now, this is an important point of departure to understand that China basically aims to decouple emissions growth from per capita income growth at lower levels of income. So if you, for example, look at the US, in the US, emissions started to decouple at around $40,000 per capita. China will have to do it at about half of that. Now, underlying this sort of, if you will, macro challenge are three distinct, unique features of China's economy that make this even more challenging. And we call these three challenges the three highs. The first is the high dependence on coal. Despite having declined in recent years, coal still makes up more than half of China's primary energy use. It's particularly important in terms of electricity generation, where the coal share has now fallen to just below half of total electricity generation. So that's the first high, the important dependence on coal in the current energy mix. The second one, and this relates very much to what I talked about at the beginning, China having to do this like most other developing countries at much lower levels of income. And what that means is that energy demand is still rising. And that's because, with economic development, what we do see is usually energy intensive, both on the production side because of industrialization, but also on the consumption side because people tend to increase for their use of all kinds of products and services, including bigger properties, more cars, and so on and so forth. And all that, unlike in a developed country where demand has flattened, in most developing countries, energy demand is growing rapidly and often faster than GDP grows. In China's case, it's growing about 5 to 7%, and that means that China will have to add about 50 to 70 gigawatt of additional generation capacity every year to meet that growing demand in a reliable manner. In addition, there are other drivers that are important. For example, urbanization. As the country urbanizes, usually emissions tend to increase and energy demand tends to increase. Now, the third high that is unique to China and that is particularly challenging is the large share of industry in China's GDP and emissions. So industry accounts for about a third of total emissions in China's case, which is higher than not just virtually all developing economies. It's also larger than most industrial or high-income economies. And a large part of that comes from heavy industries, steel and cement notably, which is very closely linked to China's very investment-driven growth model that generates demand for steel, cement, and other construction materials. Now, why is that important? It's important because in these two industries, steel and cement, either in the case of steel, low carbon alternative production technologies are either prohibitively expensive or costly, or in the case of cement, they don't even really exist, at least not at a commercial level where they can be applied at scale. So decarbonizing China's industrial sector will be uniquely challenging, and in some sense even more challenging than decarbonizing, for example, the electricity sector, where increasingly cost-effective alternatives start to emerge. Now, after pointing to all these challenges, the good news is that our report, like other reports that have been done on China, have found that under certain assumptions, notably about the development of technologies, it's possible for China to achieve this pathway. And this is what I'm showing here, which is the result of an integrated sectoral model focusing on energy, industry, and transport with a macroeconomic model. And it basically shows how the emissions profile declines over time. Now, I don't want to go through all the details here, but very important takeaway message in the case of China here is that what happens in the energy sector is absolutely critical. And here, indeed, what needs to happen is that the electricity sector is decarbonizing faster and is essentially moving ahead of the rest of the economy. And that's important for three reasons. It's first because the electricity sector in China's case makes up about half of the emissions. So it's the largest source of emissions. Secondly, in the energy sector, we do have increasingly cost-competitive alternatives available technologically that enable a faster pace of decarbonization at a cost, but it's more technically feasible than in other sectors. And thirdly, as other downstream demand sectors like transport, industry, buildings will increasingly electrify and rely, instead of fuel combustion, rely on electricity as the main energy source, it's critically important that the energy mix in the electricity generation is increasingly clean to really achieve the decarbonization objectives, for example, of moving towards more electric vehicles as opposed to traditional fuel-powered vehicles. Now, what does all of this cost? And of course, these numbers tend always to be staggering. In China's case, what we find is that the investment needs in the electricity and transport sector alone would amount to something between 14 and 17 trillion US dollars. So this is very significant. This is essentially in nominal, undiscounted terms equal to China's current GDP. Now, the good news, though, is that since this is spread over a very long period of time, in macroeconomic terms, the investment costs are well within reach. So measured as a share of GDP and spread over that period and accounting for differences in the time profile of those investments, the share of GDP necessary in incremental investment is to the tune of 1 to 1.5% of GDP for China annually. And that's, of course, not insignificant, but it seems a manageable number, especially given in China's case, its large domestic savings that could be mobilized to finance some of these investments, and the very high investment rate. So China invests about 45% of its GDP annually. So relative even to the current investment, the additional investment needs are by most accounts, in a macroeconomic sense, manageable. Now, the second dimension that is often talked about is what it means, of course, for GDP. And what I'm showing here are, again, projections quite similar to what Sati had presented in the Vietnam case. These are simulations based on obviously simplified macroeconomic models. But what we do find is that, overall macroeconomic impacts of the low carbon transition in China are not insignificant, but overall manageable. So we find that, depending on the specific policies, cumulative output effects vary between a gain of around 0.5% to a potential loss of about 2% cumulatively over the entire period. Now, perhaps more important than these estimates that are obviously subject to a lot of uncertainty and caveats that need to be applied, what we also find is that the initial decarbonization push in the first decade, basically achieving China's current NDCs, or nationally determined contributions, are positive in most respects. And that's, again, because in the energy sector, there are available technologies, and in many cases, China is a producer of these technologies. So the additional investment actually translates into higher output initially. The second point, and that is equally important, is that policies really matter here. And what we find here, and that's the difference between the two lines, the efficiency of the overall economy, the efficiency of markets, labor markets, capital markets, in enabling a reallocation of resources, capital, labor, from high carbon intensive activity to low carbon intensive activity, is very critical in determining overall adjustment costs. In fact, we find that more efficient markets, removing frictions in the reallocation of resources, could reduce adjustment costs according to these models by about half. So that's a very significant and important finding, because in a sense you need structural transformation, and for structural transformation to happen, we know usually markets operate much more efficiently and smoothly. Now, despite this relatively benign and positive picture overall on the overall macroeconomic impacts, we do find that this is no reason to be negligent or complacent about transition risks. And in China's case, like in many other large economies, these transition risks tend to be spatially or geographically concentrated. And what I'm showing here is a similar graph to what I showed you in the second slide across countries, per capita income versus per capita emissions, now for provinces across China. And what you can see is that there's a huge deal of variation. Some of the more advanced coastal regions, Shanghai, Beijing, they've effectively already decoupled emissions and economic growth. However, some of the more interior provinces, often poorer provinces that are more heavily dependent on coal and coal-related economic activity, have much higher emissions and will therefore face a disproportionate impact from the transition away from those fossil fuel sources, and namely coal. You can see here Inner Mongolia and Shanxi, for example, if these were countries, I think they would be the first and the third largest producer of coal in the world. And these coal-dependent regions are heavily vulnerable to the transition. Now, there are two dimensions to these transition risks. One is capital. And again, here in China, there is a unique challenge here, because China has a capital stock that has grown very rapidly because of its rapid economic development. And it's a capital stock that is in many ways very carbon intensive. So what we are showing here is the existing fleet of coal-fired power plants across China, and we're showing the age these power plants. Now, to start with, China has, I think, around 3,100 or so coal-fired power plants, which is more than half of the global coal plants. And the average age of these plants is only 13 years compared to an economic life, typical economic life, and Rahul can correct me on this since he's the energy expert, of 30 to 40 years, depending on the type of plant. So China will face a significant risk associated with the dislocation of this capital stock and potential stranded assets if these coal-fired power plants, and similar things could be said about some of the industrial production capacity, is depreciated at a faster pace than originally envisaged. And again, as you can see, there's regional variation, and some of these plants are again concentrated, of course, in these regions that are more coal dependent. And therefore, the impacts will be regionally asymmetric and concentrated in a few places. The second dimension is labor. And what we find here from our simulations is, without going through all the details, there are different impacts and important differences in the way different jobs will be affected across gender, regional, and skill dimensions. So we know that most workers affected by the exit of polluting industries tend to be male, less skilled, and in rural interior provinces in China. Whereas most of the job gains, meaning the emergence of new technologies and the benefits of the transition, will be concentrated predominantly in urban and higher skilled regions and in occupations that tend to have a higher female share in the workforce. So these are the challenges. Basically, the transition is feasible, but there will clearly be some industries, some regions, some workers that will be negatively affected, and it will be important to incorporate that in policy design and to ensure that this transition is ultimately equitable and fair and just, and that some of these social risks are mitigated. Now, while these risks are real, there are also opportunities that, in the case of China, are equally real. So China will likely also benefit from the decarbonization path of its own economy, but also the global shift away from fossil fuels. And I'm showing here two dimensions of that. One is jobs and one is innovation. You can see in the case of jobs, China already today has over 4 million jobs in renewable and various renewable energy related activities, more than half of the global total jobs. And of course, as China moves forward and more scale is achieved, more jobs will likely be generated. Now, the second part is innovation. And here China is, of course, generally aiming to move towards a more innovation-driven growth model. And what we argue in the report is that climate action can actually catalyze that shift towards more innovation. And we can see again that China is already generating a lot of intellectual property, in this case, patents related to climate related technologies. In some, by this measure, in terms of quantity, even exceeding some of the OECD countries. Now, we also know that the quality of these patents is different and that many of them relate to downstream manufacturing technologies as opposed to upstream foundational technologies in key sectors. So China has a very strong comparative advantage in commodifying, if you will, existing technologies as opposed to discovering new technologies. And of course, especially in the industrial sector, discovery will be important going forward. Now, let me close with a few observations on policy and what we recommend in the report. I won't go through all of them. We have recommended and organized these various recommendations across 6 packages, policy packages. Some of them are sector policies, not surprisingly focused on the electricity power sector, other key sectors with large emissions like industry and transport. But then importantly, there are also economy-wide reforms to harness markets to essentially drive cost-effective economy-wide abatement and stimulate innovation, as well as resource reallocation. Policies to manage transition risks and to ensure a just transition. And then finally, I won't go into that, but in China's case, also policies related to its external financing and trade relationships, especially with low-income economies where China is a major source of capital and a major trading partner, and can use that to stimulate low-carbon policies and action in some of these partner countries as well. Now, within that broader set of policies, let me just spend the last few minutes on economy-wide policies, because I believe that's the most relevant to this audience. And here, I think what I start with and what I want to focus on is carbon pricing. In China's case, China has established a national emissions trading system, which is, in terms of the emissions covered and subject to that carbon trading, the largest market in the world. As you can see here, the blue bars basically show GHG emissions in billion tons covered by various markets. And you can see that China's ETS is more than double the size of the EU, the second largest existing carbon market. But you can also see with the red dots that the carbon price in China, not surprisingly, still tends to be relatively low, especially if compared to more advanced economies, more advanced markets like the EU ETS. In China, it's about between $5 and $7 per ton of emitted carbon dioxide, and that's, of course, that's still relatively low, and it's lower than the social costs of carbon. Now, and China has set a trajectory to further develop the carbon market going forward, and we reinforce many of the priorities of the government here and recommend a few steps that could make the ETS gradually a more effective tool to incentivize efficient abatement in the economy. A key one is to not necessarily increase carbon prices overnight, but to provide predictable forward guidance to markets as to what can be expected. And that's a very low-cost tool that can be used, because that forward guidance, if it's credible, will already today direct investment decisions, because these prices can then be factored in the assessment of viability of different investments, including private sector investments, that under certain carbon price scenarios might become commercially viable. So it's important to give that guidance to the market to drive behavior today without having to adjust prices immediately. Expanding the coverage. Currently, the trading system only covers part of the power sector. It's planned to be expanded to other large emitting sectors, including, importantly, the industrial sector. Move towards auctioning, which would generate revenue. So initially, the permits now are given free of charge to emitters, and then there's just trading, just a reallocation. And that basically means that there's a transfer from high emitting to low emitting private sector entities, as opposed to a fiscal revenue that can be used by the government. And then, of course, in China's case, like in other cases, in addition to active carbon pricing, there's also still a question around rationalizing some remaining fossil fuel and agricultural input subsidies that are actually negative taxes on high carbon usage. Now, importantly, what we recommend in the report is that by moving towards revenue-generating carbon pricing, in the case of China, auctioning, but it could also be a carbon tax, the added advantage there is, in addition to changing the incentives for the private sector, it also gives additional resources to the public sector that can then be used to support the transition towards a low-carbon economy, including support to communities that are negatively affected, support to research and development to foster discovery and the fusion of technologies that are necessary and to drive down the cost of those technologies, public investment in low-carbon infrastructure, for example, mass transportation systems in urban areas, or even, interestingly, for ministries of finance, allowing for tax switching, where carbon tax revenue could be replaced with the removal of more distortionary taxes and make the tax system overall more efficient, in addition to the expected impacts on carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. And this is my final slide. For China, we've simulated the application of a wider carbon price. And as in many other countries, these tools are shown to be quite effective in driving abatement. They could reduce emissions with a carbon price of between $50 and $75 per ton, which is very significant. They could lower emissions by about 20% over a decade and generate about 2.6% or so of GDP in additional fiscal revenue. Now we know that the economics usually look quite positive on carbon pricing, but we also know that, of course, implementing it is both technically and politically challenging in all countries, and that's why we see across the world carbon pricing continues to be an underutilized policy tool, but it is one that could potentially be quite effective and efficient in the sense that unlike more direct interventions, changes in relative prices tend to produce better and more efficient outcomes in the sense that they typically tend to favor those investments that have the lowest relative abatement cost. With that, let me stop here. I've included here the link to the report in case this presentation has sparked your interest. You might want to check it out. And again, thank you very much for the opportunity, and back over to you, Quyen.